Joe, and today I'd like to talk about the new DC Primal Age toy line by Funko, and show you my new custom 6-inch scale articulated Primal Age or Barbarian style Batman action figure. So let's get started. Cheers. So I don't really consider myself a Funko fanatic or whatever, but it turns out that I do have quite a few of their products now that I think of it. A lot more than I thought I had. I only own 3 Funko Pops on purpose. I have a few of the Rick and Morty figures. I have a few of the Batman-related 5-star figures. I have the Catwoman, Batgirl, Wonder Woman, Poison Ivy, and Harley Quinn vinyl vixens. This is about half of my collection of the Rock Candy figures. I have a set of 3 3/4 inch Stranger Things figures. My wife actually bought these for me for Christmas the year before last, and I found the variant 11 with the blonde wig. I also have a set of the Funko Legacy 6-inch scale Firefly figures. And I like these figures a lot, even though they aren't perfect. They have pretty good articulation, a lot of accessories, pretty decent paint detail, and I think the likenesses are fairly well done for the $20 price point. I really wish that Funko would finish the crew of the Serenity and include Simon and River Tam and Nara and Shepherd Book, but I doubt that's ever going to happen now. For a year or so now, Funko has been making figures based on Mortal Kombat, old horror movies, and Thundercats in this retro Masters of the Universe style. These figures are the same scale, have similar articulation, and have an aesthetic that is similar to the old He-Man figures that Mattel made back in the 80s. Unfortunately, I don't have any of my old He-Man figures to show you now, because I sold all mine off in garage sales when I was a kid. Last fall, Funko announced a new line of these retro-style figures called DC Primal Age, which is a mashup of DC Comics and Masters of the Universe. At first, these toys were only available on Amazon, but as of January 18th, 2019, these figures should be available on Target's website and at their physical stores too. I pre-ordered my Primal Age Wonder Woman and Batman figures from Amazon, and I think I got mine back in November. I started seeing some of the Primal Age stuff pop up in Target stores right after Christmas, but they wouldn't sell any of it to me until the January 18th street date. Since then, I've picked up the t-shirt, a lunchbox, the 100-page comic book, and Ace the Bat Hound, which is the Primal Age answer to Battle Cat. Most of the figures look really fun, and there's even a Castle Grayskull-esque Batcave playset that looks amazing, but it wouldn't fit in a Detolf, and I'm trying to rein in my collecting this year to save some money, and mostly because display space is getting tight. I think Funko and Target both need to get their shit together, because the distribution on this Primal Age stuff is spotty at best, and the stores that are stocking these figures are getting cases of only villain characters. Every Target where I've seen these figures has a bunch of Jokers and 1 or 2 of the other bad guys like Mr. Freeze, Scarecrow, and King Shark. This line is going to die on the vine at retail, unless people can get characters like Batman, Aquaman, and Wonder Woman. So I don't understand why Funko would even pack villain-only cases. It just doesn't make any sense. In the US, these figures retail for about $12, which I think is a sweet spot of a price point. It's relatively inexpensive for adult collectors, and seems comparable to other toy lines aimed at kids. The paint quality on these figures is not flawless, but it's surprisingly well done for a Funko product. Unfortunately, these figures have been plagued by quality control problems. The plastic feels pretty cheap, and is prone to breaking, particularly at the hip joints. The legs fall off really easily too. In fact, when I got my figures in the mail, one of Wonder Woman's legs had fallen off and was rattling around inside the bubble. The harness on my Ace the Bat Hound here was broken straight out of the box. And it's not the end of the world or anything, but it is pretty aggravating. I would recommend warming up the plastic with hot water or a hair dryer before you try to pose them very much, or put the weapons in their hands. I seriously doubt these would hold up to heavy play if you were thinking about getting these for your kids. So I actually bought a second Batman figure just for the cape and weapon accessories that he comes with, because I wanted to use them with my custom Primal Age Batman figure. I gave this to my 2-year-old. She immediately pulls the legs off, and she's like, "Oh no, Daddy, broken!" So even though these toys have a few issues, I really love the overall concept behind the DC Primal Age. Now, it's been over 30 years since I've read one of those mini comics that came with the Masters of the Universe figures back in the day, so I don't know how it compares, but I thought this Primal Age comic was pretty fun. It's written by comics greats like Marv Wolfman, Louise Simonson, and Jerry Ordway, who also illustrates his story featuring Wonder Woman that just looks absolutely gorgeous. I'm not familiar with the other illustrators who worked on this, but most of the art is solid. Now, this book costs $10, but don't let that scare you off. When you take into consideration that a 20-page monthly comic costs anywhere between $3 and $5, then a 100-page book for $10 actually isn't that out of line. It's kind of a deal. So while I'm messing around with these figures, I keep finding myself trying to turn the wrists and bring the shoulders out to the side, bend the elbows and knees, basically just trying to manipulate articulation that isn't there. I guess it's because I'm so used to other action figures like, my super articulated Star Wars, Marvel Legends, some of the DC figures that I have, as well as some other figures I've recently picked up like the articulated icons and some import figures. I knew what I was getting into when I ordered these figures, and it's really not anybody's fault, but they just don't do all the things I want them to. And then I remembered that when Mattel made these figures based on The Dark Knight Returns, they reused parts from their Masters of the Universe Classics line. So if I got another one of these figures, I'd be well on my way to a more articulated, barbarian-style Batman that would scale better with the majority of my Batman collection. So I got this extra blue and gray Dark Knight Returns Batman from Amazon for $12 shipped. And my custom here is mostly just repainted to look closer to the Funko Batman. The cape from the Funko Primal Age Batman was way too short for this taller figure. I usually use some thin material like this, cut from an inexpensive athletic shirt, but I thought it would look too thin compared to the plastic part. So I bought a sheet of blue felt from Hobby Lobby for 30 cents that matches perfectly. I made a pattern out of a paper towel, I cut it out, and then I glued it to the inside of the plastic cape. And I wanted it to be cloth, so it wouldn't get in the way if I wanted to pose him riding Ace the Bat Hound. I sculpted the harness on his chest out of Milliput 2-part epoxy. I also used Milliput to make a mold of the Funko Batman's bat symbol and belt buckle. When the molds were fully cured, I got a dab of cooking oil on the tip of my finger and rubbed it into the molds so that when I pressed more Milliput in to cast the parts, it wouldn't stick to the inside of the mold. When the bat symbol and the belt buckle were fully cured, I was able to pull them out really easily, and then I trimmed off the excess around the edges and glued them into place on the figure. I cut apart his trunks, like right at the taint, so that it looked more like a loincloth instead of trunks. And then I cut these little triangle-shaped notches out to give it a ragged edge, as if they're made out of fur or tattered cloth. This also gives his hips better range of motion, so he sits better on the saddle on Ace the Bat Hound. I sculpted the wraps around his boots and the furry tops out of Milliput. I modified his ankle joints to give him Marvel Legends-style ankle rockers. So now, instead of just pivoting back and forth like this, they also swivel. The pegs in his ankles were wide and rectangular shaped, and went straight down into his feet. I sanded the pegs down to make them round to allow for a swivel. I filled in the peg holes in his feet with Milliput, and drilled new peg holes into the feet at an angle pointing down towards the toes. Then I sanded his ankles down to make them more rounded so it wouldn't hinder the rocker joints. Mattel only just started doing this late last year for their DC Multiverse figures, but they should have been doing it for years because it's so fucking simple. You just have to have a round peg and have it plug into the foot at a slightly different angle. It wouldn't have even cost you any extra money to do it that way. This is probably why Mattel is losing the DC license. I also drilled a hole into the small of his back to plug a flight stand into so I can get him into leaping or flying kick poses. I got a bunch of these flight stands recently and they're really great. The price for these Obitsu body flight stands kind of fluctuates a little, but they're usually somewhere between $20 and $30 for a 5-pack on Amazon. They're the best flight stands I've ever come across. When all the sculpting was done, I repainted him from head to toe with acrylic paints. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any gold paint that matches the putrid yellow gold color that the Funko Batman's weapons are cast in. So I had to repaint the weapons for my custom figure to match the gold parts of his costume. Sometimes when I'm working on a custom action figure, I use this craft glue to help protect the paint around the joints. It's kind of like super glue, but it has this applicator brush, and you just have to be really careful not to actually get the paint inside the joints, because then they won't move. At first I painted his loincloth a lighter blue, and went over it with this craft glue, but it cracked and chipped off when you stretched the softer plastic underneath. So I mixed some light blue acrylic paint with some plain old Elmer's school glue, because it flexes a little bit more after it's dry. So obviously this is a lot of trial and error. You might have to experiment with different things to achieve your desired results. Also, full disclosure, you might have noticed that when I had him on the turntable, I've been using this rubber band to help keep the shield attached to his wrist, because the clip is just slightly too large to stay on there by itself. This is just a temporary solution until I can think of something better and more permanent. So obviously, if you've ever handled either of the Dark Knight Returns Batman figures from Mattel, then you have an idea about the articulation of this custom Primal Age Batman. He's got a barbell joint at the top of his neck that allows him to look down about that far, look up about that far. Obviously, he can turn his head from side to side, and you can also tilt it from side to side too. This has gotten really loose since I've popped the head off to paint it and then put it back on the figure. The same thing happened with the other Dark Knight Returns Batman figure when I painted the shadow on the front of his cowl. So that's kind of an issue, but it's not the end of the world. He's also got disc-hinged shoulders. He's got bicep swivels, but they don't have a lot of range of motion because his biceps and triceps are so big. He's got single-hinged elbows that don't provide a huge range of motion, but probably good enough for me for this figure. He's got swivel joints at the wrist here. He's got an ab crunch joint that crunches pretty far forward, but not very far back. He's got a swivel at the waist, but the belt kind of gets in the way, so you don't get a huge range of motion there. These figures have really well articulated hips. They spread out to the sides about this far, go about this far forward, and about that far back. They also swivel at the top of the hip there, and I like that joint a lot because it's pretty well hidden by his loincloth or his trunks. They have single jointed knees. He has a swivel joint at the top of his boot cuff, and like I showed you before, he can point and flex his foot, and now he has an ankle rocker joint, kind of like a Marvel Legends figure. Here's my custom Primal Age Batman compared to the only two Masters of the Universe Classics figures I own, Skeletor and He-Man. Alright, so you've seen him a number of times next to the official Dark Knight Returns Batman figures by Mattel. Here's a couple customs that I made. One that I painted the blue highlights on his cowl, cape, gloves, and boots with a more comic accurate bat symbol on his chest. And the one on the right is from the part in Dark Knight Returns where he uses the rifle to shoot a cable to tightrope walk across, and he gets shot by the police, exposing the body armor underneath his costume. I also gave this figure a thigh strap and an ankle holster, which he uses later in the comic. I just felt like showing these guys off, but I do have a really in-depth review of my entire collection of Dark Knight Returns action figures if you're interested in checking that out. Here he is with a couple of my favorite Batman figures by Mattel, the DC Multiverse Super Friends Batman and the DC Superheroes Batman. Here he is compared to the Dark Knight Returns Superman figure that's also made up mostly of Masters of the Universe Classics parts. And a few weeks before Toy Fair, Funko announced a second wave of DC Primal Age figures, including Superman, Bizarro, Lex Luthor, Black Manta, and the Flash, as well as Krypto the Superdog for Superman to ride, which I assume will just be a repaint of Ace the Bat Hound. The design for the Primal Age Superman figure isn't really doing it for me, so I doubt I'll make a custom version for myself, but it might be something worth looking into if you want to make a more articulated 6-inch scale Primal Age Superman figure. Here he is with a few other Elseworlds style Batman. First we have the recent DC Multiverse Gotham by Gaslight Batman, my custom World War II era Liberty Files Batman, and the Batman Unlimited Vampire Batman. And I think this custom Barbarian Batman would fit in pretty well with an Elseworlds or a Legends of the Dark Knight type display. The Liberty File isn't as well known as Gotham by Gaslight or Red Rain, but the first volume is much better than both of those other stories in my opinion. It's more of a JSA story than a Batman story, but most of the best parts are centered around Batman. If you're an Elseworlds fan, you should definitely check this one out. It's excellent. Okay, now back on topic. Some of the designs for the Primal Age Batman villains don't really do much for me, and I think they look a little generic. For instance, the Scarecrow and Mr. Freeze figures, I wouldn't necessarily know who those were supposed to be without being told. And the design for the Primal Age Joker just feels wrong to me. In the comics, the Joker is supposed to be taller than Batman, but he's never been depicted as a burly muscle man, and I just can't wrap my head around it. So I doubt I'm going to be customizing any more 6-inch Primal Age style figures to go along with this Batman. This is probably just a one-off for me. But here are some of the figures I think it would be fun to pose fighting this Barbarian style Batman for photos or display. First up is a custom comic book style Killer Croc figure that I made out of the Suicide Squad Collect and Connect Killer Croc. And then we have the DC Universe Classics Man-Bat figure. Here's some other monster-y type villains that you could pit this Barbarian style Batman figure up against. There's the DC Superheroes Clayface figure, and then there's the DC Multiverse 3 3/4 inch scale Arkhamverse Solomon Grundy that I customized to look more like a traditional Solomon Grundy. Now the Build-A-Figures would be really awesome to have, but I hate buying figures I don't want just for the parts, and I haven't been able to bring myself to spend the kind of money it would cost to buy them on eBay. Here's some other larger villain characters that I have in my collection that look like they might fit pretty well fighting this Barbarian-style Batman. On the left is the DC Superheroes Darkseid figure with the head from the DC Universe Classics Build-A-Figure. I just always thought the original head was way too small. This one's probably too big, but it looks better. Then we have an old DC Direct Despero figure, and I'm not sure what series he's from exactly. I bought him loose, but I think he looks really cool next to this Primal Age Batman custom. And finally, here's a couple of figures from back in the day when Mattel really gave a shit. Here's the DC Superheroes Mongol and the DC Universe Classics Wave 1 Etrigan the Demon. I think both of these figures look excellent next to my custom Primal Age Batman. And I think these guys would look really cool posed together in a fight scene. Looking at this Mongol figure now reminds me that that's one of the things I think is missing from the DC Primal Age, is that science fiction aspect of the Masters of the Universe aesthetic. So I've done a handful of custom figures and some other projects like this custom Batcave diorama / playset. But the reason I decided to make a video about this Primal Age Batman is because I got a lot of really positive feedback from the photos of it that I shared on Instagram. I even got a shout out from Brad, the DC Universe Geek. And his YouTube channel is much bigger than mine, so I'm sure if you're watching this, you're already well aware of him. But in case you aren't, I suggest you check him out sometime. Also, I'd like to urge you to listen to the Shelf Life Collectors podcast. It's these two dudes, Adam and Blake, here in the Midwest, who talk mostly about collecting modern action figures, like Marvel Legends. They also do reviews of toy-related movies and TV shows. They get into some toy news and customizing. They also talk about Batman stuff a lot, which is right up my alley. Both of the guys are super funny, the audio quality is excellent, they don't waste your time with a bunch of ads, and they don't try to bum money off of you on Patreon. Again, that's the Shelf Life Collectors podcast, and it gets a big recommend from OG Trilogy. I've had a number of people message me over the years to ask if I take commissions or if I plan to sell my custom figures. And I like making custom action figures for fun in my free time to help fill gaps in my collection. I'm satisfied with most of my custom work, but by no means do I feel like I'm wonderful at customizing. Like I said before, it's a lot of trial and error for me. It's difficult to find time for all the custom projects I'd like to do for myself. And that's why I make videos like this. I do like to show off my collection and custom work, but I also try to provide a lot of information too. And I honestly believe that just about anybody can make custom action figures with the right tools, careful planning, and lots of practice. I get a lot of inspiration from other customizers in forums, on YouTube, and on Instagram. And I hope maybe by watching this, you'll be inspired to make your own custom action figures. Alright, so there you have it. If you've made it this far into my droning, that makes you a fucking legend in my book. I really want to thank you for joining me today, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video, share it with your friends, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this in the future. Until next time, take care. Bye.